Welcome to the global stage at Meltingpot, the biggest event for speech and interviews in Europe. Today and right now, interviewing by John Perkins, Mr. Bill McKibben.
Thank you. Thanks, Dennis, and thanks, Meltingpot. Thank you, Bill, for being here. It's such an honor to be with you on this stage, and thank you all for joining us this afternoon. I'll just say a few words about myself. My name's John Perkins. I was formerly chief economist at a major consulting firm, but my real job was that of an economic hitman. And I wrote a lot about that in a book called Confessions of an Economic Hitman, which has sold several million copies in 38 languages. But the summary version of it is a 2-minute cartoon, which we're going to show you right now. That tells you who I was. Peter, please.
Oh, yeah. We economic hitmen have managed to create the world's first truly global empire, and it's basically a secret empire. We do it many ways, but principally, we identify a country that has resources our corporations covet, like oil, arrange a huge loan to that country from the World Bank or one of its sisters. The money never actually goes to the country. It goes to our own corporations to build big infrastructure projects in that country that help a few very wealthy people, but don't benefit the majority of the people who are too poor to buy electricity or have cars to drive on the highways, and yet they're left holding a huge debt that they can't repay. So we go back at some point and say, you know, you can't pay your debts. Give us a pound of flesh, sell your oil real cheap to our oil companies, vote with us on the next critical UN vote, allow us to build a military base in your backyard, something along these lines. And when we fail, the jackals go in and either overthrow or assassinate these leaders. And if the jackals fail, as they did in Iraq, then we send in the military. I don't think the failure is capitalism. I think it's a specific kind of capitalism that we've developed. We've created what I consider a mutant, viral form of capitalism. And this mutant form of capitalism, which I think is really a predatory form of capitalism, has created an extremely unstable, unsustainable, unjust, and very, very dangerous world. I've met a lot of terrorists. I've interviewed them for books. I've never met one who wanted to be a terrorist. They're desperate people. If we want to get rid of terrorism, we must get rid of the root causes, that cancer that is destroying our whole system. Because I think it's really important that we understand today, we cannot have homeland security unless we understand that the whole planet is our homeland.
So, what's interesting, Bill, is it's very humbling. I didn't have anything to do with making that video. It showed up on YouTube with my voice, with not my permission, but I was happy to have it. But it's very humbling and humiliating to realize that I spent several years writing a book that's over 200 pages long, and these people managed to tell the whole story in 2 minutes. So yeah, so one of my jobs as an economic hitman was to create what we're now calling a death economy, an economic system that's based on maximizing short-term profits and materialistic consumption, regardless of the social and environmental costs. And this is a system that's polluting and consuming itself into self-destruction. It's depleting in the short term all the resources it needs for the long term. But I think what we're all here about, and I know what one of the things Bill promotes is something that economists increasingly are calling a life economy, an economic system that has a goal of maximizing long-term benefits for all life on the planet. And it's an economic system that pays people to clean up pollution, to regenerate destroyed environments, to recycle, to develop new technologies that enhance life on this planet rather than ravaging the planet. And so I've been spending, ever since I stopped being an economic hitman back in the 80s, I've devoted most of my life to making that happen, as Bill has also. And I just want to say that where you are right now, where we are, is an incredible model. It gives me goosebumps to think of this, of how that can happen. So here we are in this complex that at one time was known as the heart of steel for the Soviet Union. Huge, huge steel factory built on top of a coal mine. And in the 90s, it basically ran out of coal and didn't produce steel anymore. So this whole area essentially was faced with terrible tragedy, bankruptcy, no jobs, a destroyed economy. But instead, they turned it into this magnificent venue for the arts, basically, for music, for art, for discussions like this, for many incredible things. And so I think the Czech Republic, in a way, has been a leader in this regard, and especially this particular area right here. And so it's a thrill to be with you, Bill, here at this time. And just a few words about Bill. I think a lot of you probably already know about him, but he wrote really the first book on global warming, The End of Nature, in 1989. Who can remember that far back, right? I think a number of people in our audience were not even born at that time. And founded the 350.org, the first global grassroots climate campaign, which has organized more than 20,000, it's probably counting, 20,000 plus demonstrations in every country on Earth except North Korea. What's the matter with North Korea? And he was awarded the Right Livelihood Award, sometimes called the Alternative Nobel Prize, in 2014 in the Swedish Parliament, and has also won the Gandhi Peace Prize and honorary degrees from 20 colleges and universities. In recent years, he founded Third Act, which organizes people over the age of 60 for progressive action and climate democracy. So I think it's fair to say that Bill is a beacon who shines a light on a system that's built on extraction, exploitation, pollution, reckless consumption of resources, and that has brought us to the brink of ecological collapse, the death economy. But he does a lot more than shining that light, because Bill has led us down an alternative path that offers hope and concrete ways to move, to transform the death economy to the life economy. So without saying any more, Bill, take it away.
Well, John, thank you. Thank you very much for being here to talk today, and to everybody else. And what a pleasure for me to be here for many reasons. When I said I would come and talk, I did not know that by the time I had gotten here, we would have just come through the hottest day ever recorded in human history, the hottest week ever recorded in human history, the hottest month ever recorded in human history, that the temperature of the oceans would be at an all-time high. It's a pleasure for me to be here, in part because my home in the U.S. is brutally hot right now, and where I live, in Vermont in the United States, we've just come through record flooding that's destroyed many of our cities. One of my neighbors a half-mile away lost his home in a landslide last weekend. So it's nice to be here where there's, at least for the moment, kind of cool, but not so very far away. I mean, Europe right now is going through, southern Europe, through probably the greatest heat wave it's ever experienced. It was 42 degrees Celsius in Rome the day before yesterday. In our American Fahrenheit scale, it was 118, I think, in Sardinia the day before yesterday. The world is seeing stuff we've never seen before. Another way of saying that is, we're on a different world than we've inhabited in the past. And the reason for that is sadly very, very clear and should come as really no surprise to anyone. I did write the first book about climate change way back in 1989 when I was in my 20s. We knew everything that we know now about climate change in 1989. We knew that when you burned coal and gas and oil, you put carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and that its molecular structure trapped heat near the planet that would otherwise radiate back out to space. Scientists knew how much it was going to warm and how fast, and they told us. We had good advance warning of what was going to happen. And we did nothing. Human beings have emitted more carbon dioxide since 1989 than in all of human history before that. We'll get to the reasons we did nothing in a minute, but first, let's just say, now we can see in the starkest possible terms what that looks like. So far, we've raised the temperature of the Earth 1.2 degrees Celsius. That doesn't sound like that much. You know, if it was, 19 degrees when we walked in here and it's 20 degrees when we walk out, our bodies won't be able to tell the difference, really. But it turns out that across an entire planet, that's a huge change. So use different units to think about it. The extra heat that we trap near the Earth each day because of the carbon we've emitted is the heat equivalent of about 400,000 Hiroshima-sized bombs every day. And when you think about it in those terms, it gets easier to understand how we've melted most of the ice, sea ice in the summer Arctic, and begun the process, quickly the process of thawing the vast, vast ice sheet at the South Pole. How we've managed already to raise the sea level of the planet at least a foot and accelerating dramatically. How we've managed to fundamentally screw up the way that water moves around the planet. If you want one fact to understand the 21st century, probably a good one is warm air holds more water vapor than cold. That's just basic physics, okay? And what that means is that in dry areas, California, the Mediterranean, you get much more evaporation, and then you get drought, and then inevitably things catch on fire. And that's why we've seen the largest forest fires that the world's ever seen, year after year for the last decade or so. At the moment, wildfires burning in Canada have burned more acreage already this year than is ever in a complete year before, and we're still only midway through July. The smoke from those wildfires is pouring down the east coast of the United States, which actually is a good thing. That corridor of New York and Washington is probably the most powerful and important source of power in the whole world, and it's useful that people in those places are, for a little while, getting to breathe the same air that so much of the world breathes every day. Once that water vapor has gone up in the atmosphere, it's going to come down. So in wet areas, we get far more deluges, downpours, than we used to. In the eastern United States, where I live, we get about 70% more of those flooding rains. That's bad, and it's been really painful in my home state to watch places I love get wrecked in the last week. But we still have enough money in the US that we'll be able to kind of recover from that, at least in the short run. That's not true in much of the world. Pakistan last year had the biggest floods on this planet since Noah, I think. And they were unbelievable. There were parts of Pakistan that got 800% of their average annual rainfall in 3 weeks. That is, in 3 weeks, they got 8 times more rain than they usually get in a year. There's no way to prepare for something like that. People in that part of the world usually live in mud brick houses, which is a very good architecture that makes a lot of sense. Until it rains like that, people's houses just melted away around them. Before it was done, 33 million people had been displaced. I should know this, but what's the population of Czechoslovakia, of Czech Republic? About 10 million. 3 times the population of the Czech Republic displaced. There's still 20 million people 8 months later depending on humanitarian aid from the UN just to have enough to eat. And here's the kicker. Basically, Pakistan did nothing to cause the problem that it's in. There's 200 million people there, but they only produced about 1% of all the carbon in the atmosphere. The United States, which has 300 million people, so roughly the same population, has produced 25% of all the carbon in the atmosphere. Europe trails the US, but not by much. Think how much carbon the steelworks that we're sitting in at the moment put into the atmosphere over the decades that it was in operation. So climate change is not just the most dangerous thing we've ever done, it's the most unfair thing we've ever done, which is saying a lot in a world that's produced colonialism and imperialism and a lot of other unfair things as well. The entire continent of Africa has produced about 2% of all the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and yet Africa is suffering more already from climate change than any other place in the world. And the scary part of this story is we're still pretty near the beginning. We've raised the temperature 1.2 degrees Celsius, but we're on a path to raise the temperature, sort of our business as usual path, our trajectory, will raise the temperature of the planet 3 degrees Celsius in the course of this century. If we allow that to happen, it's pretty clear now, I think most scientists would agree, that we will not have civilizations like the ones we're used to having. There's just too much violent flux and chaos in those numbers. The UN estimates, for instance, that that would produce between 1 billion and 3 billion climate refugees on this planet. So let's take the low estimate, 1 billion refugees. Think about what happened in Europe when there were 1 million refugees from the Syrian civil war that came towards Europe. Think what that did to the politics of Europe and how much ugliness it brought out and so on and so forth. Now multiply that by 1,000 for 1 billion refugees and try to imagine what happens around the world. Any of the things we care about, development, women's rights, war and peace, all these things will just be overwhelmed in this cauldron that we're building. So our job is, and it's the most important job humans have ever undertaken, is to not stop climate change, it's too late for that, but to stop it short of the place where it cuts our civilization off at the knees. And in order to do that, we're going to have to move very, very fast. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the group assembled of scientists assembled by the UN to study these things, has told us that if we wanted to meet the targets that we'd set in Paris back in 2015, we'd now need to cut our emissions, basically cut our use of fossil fuel in half by 2030. 2030 is, by my watch, 6 years and 5 months away, okay? That doesn't give us much time at all to work. All right, for the moment, that's the end of the bad news. I'll give you slightly better news. We know, in a way that we didn't even a few years ago, what to do about this or how to deal with this. In the last decade, engineers have reduced the cost of energy from the sun and the wind and the batteries to store that power when the sun goes down or the wind drops, they've reduced the cost of those things 90%. We now live on a planet where the cheapest way to produce power is to point a sheet of glass at the sun. That's an extraordinary change, one that we haven't yet really, I think, wrapped our minds around. We still think of renewable energy as alternative energy, but in fact, it's the most obvious way to produce power on our planet now, the most sensible way. And there's no longer a real technological or financial obstacle to doing it fast. It doesn't mean that it comes without costs, because there are costs. You have to mine lithium or cobalt to produce those batteries. Some of that's done really badly on this planet with environmental and human rights problems that we've got to tackle. But those problems are orders of magnitude smaller than the problems of a planet that's heating that fast. It's an exciting moment in this way. Here's how I've come to think about it. For 700,000 years, human beings have been setting things on fire. It's our oldest habit as a species. Darwin said that the two things that marked human beings really were the use of language and the use of fire. And it was good for us. I mean, you know, because we had fire, we learned to cook food, which allowed us to have the big brain that we enjoy. It allowed us to move north and south away from the equator. It allowed us, the anthropologists think, that standing around the campfire every night for, you know, hundreds of thousands of years built the social bonds that mark our species. And then, in the Industrial Revolution, when we learned to control the combustion of coal and gas and oil, it produced modernity. It produced the world that we know. But now, all of a sudden, the cost of combustion is higher than the benefit. I mean, the biggest of those costs is the existential climate crisis that I've just described. But there are other costs too. One of them is that when you burn things, you put particulates in the air, those get in your lungs and they kill you. 9 million people a year die from breathing the combustion byproducts of fossil fuel. That's 1 death in 5 on this planet. 20% of all the deaths on this planet come because people have to suck in those particulates in their lungs. If you've been to Delhi or Shanghai in recent years, you've seen that kind of pollution, but I'm willing to bet that if you'd been in Ostrava when this steelworks was operating, you would have been breathing the same kind of stuff into your lungs. So that would be nice to get rid of that. It would also, and here's the third reason to want to end combustion, as long as you depend on resources that are only available in a few places, the people who control those few places will end up with more power than they deserve. That's why that little cartoon about your work was so powerful. It showed what happened to the people in those places. The same thing's true all over the world. Think about what's happened in Europe in the last 2 years. The biggest oil and gas baron in Europe is Vladimir Putin. And he took his winnings, winnings from the oil and gas casino, he took them and used them to launch a land war in Europe in the 21st century. It would be very nice to have a world that ran on sun and wind, because sun and wind are available everywhere, and there will not be a Vladimir Putin of sun and wind in the future. That would be nice. So, We have the biggest problem we've ever faced, and we have a workable solution to it. The question is, why aren't we, in an all-out effort, doing everything we can to make this happen as fast as we can? We're beginning to work at it, and you see windmills and solar panels and things going up, but it's not like we're devoting all the efforts of our civilization to doing this. And the reason, above all, and this has been the reason for the last 35 years, is because there's a powerful industry that doesn't want it to happen. The fossil fuel industry, the coal and gas and oil industry, does not want to surrender its business. For them, if you're Exxon and you've made a fortune for 100 years selling people every month a new delivery of oil, the idea that someone would put a solar panel on the roof and then the sun would deliver their energy for free every morning when it rose above the horizon, that's the dumbest business model of all time. And you will do what you can to prevent it, and that's what they've done. We now know from very good reporting that companies like Exxon or Shell or BP or Total or any of the others knew all about climate change back in the 1980s. When I was writing my book, their scientists were also studying climate change, and they were reaching all the right conclusions. They, for instance, Exxon's scientists told their executives what the temperature was going to be in 2020, and they were pretty much spot on accurate. And they were believed. Exxon's executives began, for instance, building all their drilling rigs higher because they knew that the level of the ocean was going to start rising. What they didn't do was tell the rest of us. Instead, they spent lots and lots and lots of money building this whole machine of climate denial and disinformation. They kept the whole world locked in this completely stupid debate about whether or not global warming was real or not for 30 years. Remember, both sides knew the answer to that question at the beginning. It's just one of those sides was willing to lie. And it turns out to have been the most important lie in human history because it cost us the thing we most need, which is time. That's why we have 6 years to cut emissions in half instead of 35 or 40 years that we would have had if we'd gotten started right when scientists gave us the first alarm. They're continuing to do this, continuing to use their power to delay action. You can't really get away with all-out climate denial anymore. There have been too many storms, too many heat waves, too many fires. But you can still get away with using all your power to slow down this transition. And that's what they're doing, trying to keep their business model going 2 or 3 more decades, even at the cost of breaking the planet, which it's clear now will be the cost if they get away with it. The only way to beat that power, and it's a very big power, they have billions upon billions of dollars to spend. The only way to beat that is to build movements that are strong enough to try and challenge that power. So that's what some of us have been doing for the last 15 or 20 years. I started with 7 college students, a group about 15 years ago called 350.org that was the first effort at a global grassroots climate movement. And as you say, it's been effective. The strange name 350.org comes from what scientists had then discovered was the most carbon you could safely have in the atmosphere, 350 parts per million. We were already past that. We're now at about 420 parts per million. That's why the Arctic melts, and California catches on fire, and we have floods in Pakistan. We started that work, and as you say, we've organized demonstrations all over the world and had some effect. We were able to launch this big campaign in North America to stop what was called the Keystone Pipeline, which became the biggest environmental battle in America in many, many years, and the first time that big oil really took a defeat because we were able to block it. We launched this fossil fuel divestment campaign to get institutions to sell their stock in coal and oil and gas as a way of protest and also as a way to reduce their access to capital. And that's been successful too. We're at about $40 trillion now in institutions and endowments and portfolios that have sold their stock. Most of the famous universities in the world, for instance, Harvard and Cambridge and Oxford and the University of California and on and on. That's been good, not enough, but good. We need much more of it. And here's where I'm going to end by saying the best thing that happened from that work has been this extraordinary explosion in the number of young people taking on these fights. When we did this fossil fuel divestment campaign on campuses around the world, young people really did the work, and then when they graduated, they wanted to keep on working. In the US, they formed this thing called the Sunrise Project, Sunrise Movement, and they were the ones that came up with the Green New Deal. And that finally was what persuaded the US Congress to pass some kind of legislation for the first time last year that allows us to build out solar and wind and things. And of course, you all know in Europe, the extraordinary work that was started by young people. I had the pleasure last month of writing my friend Greta Thunberg to congratulate her on her graduation from high school, okay? Very few people who have done more before they got out of high school than Greta. There are 10,000 Gretas around the world, great young leaders, and they have 10 million followers. That's how many people were out in the streets in September 2019 on climate strike before the pandemic hit and kind of knocked things back for a while. That is superb. Young people should be in the lead. It's their lives that are going to be most affected. You and I are going to be dead before the worst of this kicks in. But I've heard too many people say to me, oh, it's up to the next generation to solve these problems. That seems wrong, and it also seems completely impractical. Because young people, for all their energy and intelligence and idealism, lack the structural power to make change on the scale we need in the time we have. That's why I've spent the last few years organizing old people like me to back up these young people in their incredible work. We're doing this third act thing, first in America, but it's sort of spreading around the world. We're organizing people over the age of 60 to take action, to back up young people. We just have come off this big day of action in the US where we organized 100 demonstrations against the 4 big banks, Chase Bank, Citibank, Bank of America, that are the biggest funders in the world of the fossil fuel industry, the ones that give them the money that let them keep building new pipelines and things. And these 100 demonstrations were great. We had old people sitting in outside banks, blocking them, closing them down for the day in 100 cities. I was in Washington, D.C. at the biggest of these rallies, and to close, I'm now at the age where the idea of sitting on the sidewalk for 4 or 5 hours in a sit-in is not so much fun. So we went to all the old, Goodwill stores, all the old consignment stores, used furniture stores, and we found hundreds of old rocking chairs that people didn't need anymore. And that's what we used for our sit-in, and we closed down the banks with hundreds of old people in rocking chairs. It was definitely the most comfortable that I've ever been, waiting for the police to come put me in handcuffs. And it was great. The next day, the New York Times had a big story about the rocking chair rebellion that was underway. So I hope that everybody figures out ways to get involved in this kind of work, and right now. The things that we've been doing so far are important and good, but they're not enough. If they were enough, then the temperature wouldn't still be rising. I don't know whether this is a phrase that people use outside the US or not, but we need to be outside our comfort zone because the planet is way outside its comfort zone. That'll mean different things for different people. Not everybody needs to go get arrested. I've been arrested now a dozen times or something, and so, that's just one tool. There are many, many other ways to make a serious difference here, but you have to find other people to do it with. People, when they think about climate change, I think, spend too much time thinking about what they're going to do in their own lives. It's important to make your own life as clean as you can, but we are not going to solve this problem one Tesla at a time, one vegan dinner at a time. The most important thing an individual can do is be less of an individual and join together with others in movements that are large enough to change the economic and political ground rules here. That's how India freed itself from British rule. That's how black people in America got the right to vote. That's how people in the Czech Republic brought down communism. That's how we're going to take on climate change if we take it on together in as big movements as possible. I'll just end by saying this is the job for people on our time on this planet. It may be the most important job that our species has ever had, and we've only got a little while to do it, which is scary, but in some sense it also makes it easier. It means that if you pour yourself into it for the next few years, then we'll find out whether we did enough or not, It's not a problem that we're going to have with us forever, because if we don't solve it soon, it'll be beyond the ability of people to solve. That's different from other political problems we've faced in the past, because in the end, this is a political problem, true, but it's basically a problem of physics. Physics is our opponent here, and physics is very immature. Physics is not going to change the way that it operates just because it would be economically good for us, or we're at a difficult place in our political evolution or whatever. Physics is going to do what physics will, and our job is to meet the challenge that it has set. There I will stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bill. I'm going to open this up to questions from the audience, which I see already in just a minute, but I wanted to make a couple of comments. Particularly the analogy that you had of the smoke coming down from Canada down to the power bases in the United States. And I'm recalling, I taught an MBA program in Shanghai to Chinese students a few years back, And I was very struck by how these young Chinese students said, you know, we created an economic miracle in this country. Incredible economic growth, brought over 800 million people out of poverty. They said it came at a horrible price environmentally and socially, but we've had to live with a terrible pollution. We grew up with that. We're not going to let our kids grow up with that. We know we can create a miracle. We've done it economically. Now we're going to do it on the green side. And, you know, I think that throws out a challenge for all of us. I came back to the United States, and I was speaking at a conference. It happened to be held in at Cornell University of about 2,000 MBA students. And I told them the story of the Chinese, and I said, don't you let it happen. Let's, in the United States, be the greenest country. Let's have the Czech Republic be the greenest country. Let's have a World Cup. We've just got the Women's World Cup coming up soon. Let's have a World Cup every year of what country has shown the greatest. You know, I think that's our hope lies in us coming together. And I'm also taken by, you know, the idea of community and how much easier it is these days with social networking, how we can, and you've used that very effectively, bring people together. And as a plug for the next talk, after this one, Kimmin, who's down here, and I'll be going into a lot more detail about what each individual can do to participate in this. So having said that, I know there's at least one question out there because I saw the microphone. Yes, please. Please identify yourself to begin with, if you don't mind.
Hi, my name is Radek, and I'm watching this climate and everything and care about it for, as you said, for years and years, and nothing really seems to be going the right way. And since you mentioned that we are running out of time and the big corporations care just about the money, isn't the best solution right now just to give them offer they cannot refuse? So let's, hey, corporations, here is the incentive. You will get the next 50 years tax-free in our country. You will get billions in incentives if you build in next 10 years the biggest wind and solar projects and help us solve this.
So in a sense, that's what's going on right now in the US. We passed this Inflation Reduction Act bill last year in Congress, and what it really provides is hundreds of billions of dollars in tax credits to companies of all kinds to go build wind power and solar power and things. And it's working to a large degree. People are putting up factories to build batteries and solar plants and things. It's not, the oil companies have not joined up to do any of this. And the reason is the reason sort of that I described earlier. You can make a lot of money doing solar power or batteries, but you can't make as much money as these companies have made in the past, just because you only get money really once when you put up the solar panel. You don't get money every month because people need more oil. So for them, it doesn't produce the same kind of returns, and they're addicted to those. Just last week, Shell Oil 2 years ago, you may remember there was a big climate conference in Glasgow, Scotland, and all the oil companies were lining up to make these net zero pledges and so on and so forth. Shell Oil said that it would reduce its oil and gas output 2% a year through 2030. That was a small promise, but it was something, you know, they'd begun to make this shift. Last week, they said, we're not going to do it. And the reason was pretty clear. They'd made so much money since the war in Ukraine started and the price of oil went up that they just couldn't bring themselves to give up any of it. They said, we're going to keep our production exactly where it was before because it's in the interest of our shareholders to do that. So we're hoping for, I think, two things now. One of them is that these companies that are making batteries and whatever will become politically powerful enough to challenge the power of the oil companies. That's a horrible way to think about the world, but and the other is that we will continue building movements of citizens strong enough to begin to really put pressure on those oil companies to change. That pressure is going to come from many places. One of them is that around the world now, cities and states and countries are starting to sue the big oil companies for the damages that they've caused. So just last week in America, Oregon, which had a horrible, horrible heat wave 2 years ago that killed a lot of people and did extraordinary damage, they announced that they were suing Exxon and BP and others for $52 billion. This is sort of what happened in the tobacco industry 25 or 30 years ago. There was huge public pressure on them to change, and there were a whole series of legal suits and things, and together that was enough to at least begin pushing the cigarette companies to act differently, to stop their marketing, so on and so forth. One of the things that happened was that the big cigarette companies took all their marketing and stuff and went to Asia and built a huge market in Asia. We do not want that to happen with coal and gas and oil because it's not fair to people in Asia, but also because it's global warming. We have to do this same thing all over the world. And I'll just add, what you saw in Shanghai was prophetic, because the Chinese are now building renewable energy far faster than any place else on the planet. Something like almost half of all the renewable energy that got built on this planet last year was in China alone. So there are real signs of that growth elsewhere. But you're absolutely right to think that the oil companies should be doing this, but I don't think they will. Usually, when there's a new technology that comes along, it's not the people who it wasn't the people who were good at making carriages that ended up making cars, you know. It wasn't the people who were good at making the old kind of telephone with the cord on it that ended up dominating the cell phone market, because they always try to hold on to their own business instead of exploring the new one.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you. Another question?
Yeah, right over here, actually. I'm a little disturbed by the ageism. I'm 52. I can't join your organization because of these
we don't check
limits.
ID, you know. So if you want in, you've got just enough gray hair to pass. So,
Thank you.
You know,
my question was actually about China, because obviously there was comments last week. President Xi basically said, we're going to do climate change the way we want to do it. We're not going to list anybody else or be on anybody else's timelines. I've been coming to this thing for 10 years. I've heard lots of discussions about this. I always get a little bit down on this whole subject because it feels like only an authoritarian regime like China can move fast enough. The IRA is amazing. We're all tied up in permits and speeding up this process. I mean, this country has highways that haven't been finished for 40 years because one farmer doesn't want to give up a piece of his field. So is China the model we're going to have to follow to save the world?
First of all, I think not. There are lots of things that authoritarian governments can't do well. And one of them, it turns out to be innovation. The Chinese are good now at producing low-cost solar panels, but it was really work done in the US and Germany and elsewhere that came up with those technologies in the first place. And for all its many, many flaws, endless flaws, capitalism is good at producing things once there's a demand for them, you know? And so I think we'll see, with sufficient incentive, change coming everywhere. And authoritarian governments have big problems in terms of making these changes too. China's begun to work, but you know what? There's huge parts of the world where we're slowed down immensely because authoritarianism has prevented the rise of civil society and its ability to pressure governments. India is probably the most important country in terms of the fact that it's where China was 15 years ago in its energy curve. It could be the first big country to move towards, to build out itself on renewable energy because it's cheap now. But India is becoming ever more repressive. The Modi government is a really bad government, and they took the Greta Thunberg of India, a wonderful woman named Diva Rashi, and put her in jail. So they didn't let her to come to the last climate conference. She was in jail. So I think we need open and free societies, not only because they're much better to live in, and you know, we wouldn't really want to run a solar-powered gulag around the world, you know, if we could help it, but also because that kind of pressure is, I think, key towards pushing most of the world in the right direction.
And I'd like to add that in a way, I think we're all part of a consumer democracy. So I'd like to say, and again, in the next session we'll talk more about this, but every time you buy something from a company that you think is trying hard to be greener, don't just buy the good product, also send them an email or a text or however you want to do it and thank them and encourage them to continue. And send an email to a company you decided not to buy from because they weren't so green, and let them know that you're not going to buy from them ever again until they become greener. So I think this democracy thing is part of our consumerism also. Anyone else? Another question?
Yeah. My name is Tomáš Kazda. I'm working as associate professor at Brno University of Technology. I'm leader of the battery research group at that university. The first mention about the influence of greenhouse gases is here almost 200 years ago, because it was first mentioned by Mr. Fourier in 1824, I guess. And so I fully agree that we have signed about these things for a long period. I fully agree that also the companies, like oil company, push against the changes in the electricity, for example. However, there are some coincidences in the case of the ExxonMobil. They financed the research of lithium-ion batteries in the 70s. And one of the Nobel Prize winner, Mr. Whittingham, was leader of the battery research group on ExxonMobil. So without influence or without investment of the ExxonMobil, probably the lithium-ion batteries will be on the market maybe like 20 years after. So that's one small positive thing of like ExxonMobil. So that was just a small comment, and I have a question, maybe two questions. What do you think about the Chinese influence to the countries like in South Africa, or Africa or South America, with the sources of the materials for the batteries generally or solar panels? Because the China usually buy or give the loans to the countries, and like it's a new version of imperialism of China, and they try to or like have our market with the new materials, with the materials for new type of technologies. How we can fight with these things? And other questions, what do you think about the hydrogen technologies? Because also hydrogen technologies was, and still, they are still pushed by the oil companies, because currently just 4% of the hydrogen worldwide is produced like green hydrogen, and rest is from oil and coal.
Yeah, two questions there. The first one is about China and their effects abroad. I mean, Chinese economic hitmen are no more benign than ones that come from the West, and much the same system. One of the nice things about moving towards a renewable energy system will be eventually we can break some of that power, because if you can produce energy locally from the sun and the wind, you've taken one thing that you depend on the rest of the world for away. 80% of the world lives in countries that are net importers of fossil fuel, and so for them, the renewable energy revolution is a huge gain because they're no longer shipping off money every month to Saudi Arabia or Texas or Russia. They're producing it close to home. So it's a start anyway. And I've already forgotten hydrogen. Yeah, I think that mostly hydrogen is a mistake because it's an effort to keep finding something to burn, okay? And that's what fossil fuel companies are good at. Their whole business model is about selling you stuff to burn, and so they're excited about hydrogen, especially, as you say, because most of it at the moment is made with natural gas. If we have truly green hydrogen produced with solar energy, there are some places where it makes sense, but mostly the challenge is to just directly use the power of the sun to produce electricity that we then use to run almost everything. There are a few things that'll be hard to run on electricity. Transcontinental jet travel may be a hard thing. We probably should be doing less of it anyway, but that may be a use case for some kind of fuel in the future. We used to think that producing steel required such high temperatures that we couldn't do it from electricity alone, but actually now people are fairly quickly developing alternative processes that seem to work pretty well. And so we may not need things like hydrogen even for that. The goal is to use energy from heaven, not energy from hell. That's the basic challenge of the next period. And eventually there'll be lots of interesting technologies, maybe small modular nuclear reactors someday, maybe a lot of geothermal energy someday, maybe some power from tides and waves someday. For the next couple of decades, which is the crucial period, the things that we have available that are cheap are solar panels, wind turbines, and batteries. And our job is to build a lot of them very fast. That's the basic human task for the foreseeable future, while people in universities do a good job of looking at the next round of technology that you and I will never really see because it will happen after our time. Our job is to have a world intact enough that there'll be some point in continuing that work. If we don't bring the rapid rise in temperature under control fast, then we will not have civilizations anymore that are capable of doing the next interesting rounds of technology. All we'll be doing is responding to one emergency after another. The last month on this planet should have given us some sense of that. It has been scary as hell in place after place after place after place. The disasters we've seen with the heat of the last month are a foretaste of what's coming unless we get our act together very, very fast. This may be the last real slap in the face that we're going to get in time to make change. The next 18 months are going to be very, very chaotic because this El Nino heating that's coming in the Pacific will raise the high temperatures we already have even higher. We're going places not only that we've never seen before, in our lifetimes. The scientists think that the temperatures on this planet in the first week of July were higher than they've been for at least the last 125,000 years, probably the last million years, okay? So not only has, I mean, that means that we're living with different climate than any human being that we would recognize as a human being. I mean, that takes us back a million years before Homo sapiens, okay? This is entirely new. It's as if we are living on a different planet than all the people who came before us. And we have to adapt to that planet, but we also have to keep it from getting any crazier. We can't, in essence, keep moving the planet closer to the sun, which is what we're doing now. We have to take advantage of that sun, which will let us back off a little bit. That's the moment at which we live. It's in some ways the most interesting moment in human history. In a way, climate change is a test of whether or not the big brain was a good adaptation for human beings. Clearly, the big brain gets us in a lot of trouble. Now we'll figure out if it can solve that problem. My guess is that the answer will lie on how big the hearts connected to those brains turn out to be. Whether or not we can muster the human solidarity necessary to make the change that we need in the time that we have. We do not know the answer. We will find out in the lifetime of everyone in this room. Be the people that help make that answer come out right. That's all I got.
And that's the end of our time, but that was a great, great ending. Thank you so much, Bill. Thank you. Thank you, Bill. Thank you. And thank all of you.